The common image of the First World War is one of relentless, mindless slaughter. Of men ordered over the top to their certain deaths, charging into machine gun fire for a few yards of muddy ground. And while this was horrifyingly true in the great named battles like the Somme and Verdun, the reality of daily life in the quieter sectors of the Western Front was often something very different, something far stranger and more complex. In these sectors, away from the prying eyes of their generals, the frontline soldiers on both sides, British, French, and Germanophone, developed a secret, unspoken system. It was a conspiracy of common sense, a rebellion of the common soldier against the insanity of total war. It was known as the live and let live system. It was a tacit agreement not to kill each other, an informal truce born of shared misery and a mutual desire to survive. This is the story of how enemies, living just yards apart, created their own private peace in the middle of a world at war, and how the High Command did everything in its power to stamp it out. To understand how such a system could even exist, we must first understand the unique environment of trench warfare. By the end of 1914, the war on the Western Front had bogged down into a static line of parallel ditches stretching for hundreds of miles. The soldiers were not nomads on a moving battlefield. They were neighbors in a fixed, terrible neighborhood. They lived in the same mud, endured the same rain, hated the same rats, and were tormented by the same lice. They were enemies, but they were also the only other people in the world who could possibly understand the specific misery of their existence. This proximity led to a strange kind of intimacy. The trenches were often so close, sometimes only 30 or 40 yards apart, that soldiers could hear the enemy talking, singing, or even snoring. They could smell what the other side was cooking for breakfast. This wasn't an abstract enemy on a map. This was a group of other men, who's like tin, living in a mirror image of their own hell. The live and let live system didn't begin as a formal agreement. It grew organically, out of a series of small, individual acts of restraint. A soldier would see an enemy soldier struggling to carry a heavy ration box and would hold his fire. The next day, that same courtesy might be returned. It was based on the simple, powerful principle of reciprocity. If you don't try to kill me, I won't try to kill you. The system was most prevalent in quieter sectors of the front, those that weren't part of a major offensive. In these areas, both sides understood that aggressive action would only lead to retaliation, which would lead to more retaliation, and a peaceful sector could quickly become a hot one, resulting in pointless deaths for everyone. The soldiers realized they had a shared interest in keeping the peace. They developed a sophisticated, unspoken language of signals to maintain their secret truce. For example, morning was often a time of truce. The British had their morning hate, a ritualistic but often deliberately inaccurate firing of a few shells. The Germans had their own version. This wasn't meant to kill anyone. It was for show. It was a way to satisfy the generals in the rear who read the daily reports and expected to see evidence of an offensive spirit. The soldiers were firing, but they were aiming high, deliberately missing the enemy's trenches. It was an act of ritualized aggression, a performance for an audience that wasn't there. Mealtimes were almost universally respected. An unspoken rule developed that you did not shoot at the enemy while they were eating or while their ration parties were bringing up food. A British soldier wrote in his diary about seeing a group of Germans lining up for their soup. "It would have been murder to fire on them," he wrote. "And anyway, our own tea was just being brought up." This wasn't just about chivalry. It was about self. If you shelled the enemy's cookhouse, you could be certain that your own would be targeted in return. Even sanitation became part of the agreement. The latrines were often in exposed positions. Both sides quickly learned to respect a truce when men were attending to the calls of nature. It was an act of basic human decency, an acknowledgement that even in war, some things were off. Artillery fire was another area governed by these secret rules. In many sectors, the artillery on both sides would fire at the same time every day, like clockwork, at the same useless targets behind the lines. This firing was predictable and therefore easy to avoid. As long as you were in your dugout at the appointed hour, you were perfectly safe. It was a way for the artillerymen to expend their daily quota of shells without actually hurting anyone. The system only broke down when a new, more aggressive battery was moved into the sector and didn't understand the local customs, leading to a bloody re-education process. Perhaps the most humane aspect of the system was the tacit agreement to allow both sides to recover their wounded and bury their dead from no man's land. Officially, this required a formal truce arranged by officers, but on the front lines, it often happened spontaneously. One side might put up a sign, or simply have a soldier walk out with a white flag. The other side would hold its fire, and for a few hours, the killing would stop as men from both armies worked to give their fallen comrades a proper burial. This system was a delicate ecosystem of trust, maintained by a constant, unspoken negotiation. But how did the soldiers communicate these complex rules without speaking? They used signals. A single shot fired high into the air might mean we are about to start our daily shelling. Take cover. A sign held up over the parapet with a message scrawled on it, like lunchtime, was common. Sometimes they would just shout across no man's land. German soldiers who had worked in Britain would often serve as town criers, yelling messages in English. "Stop shooting! Tommy! We want to sleep." Or "Don't repair that section of wire tonight. Our patrol is coming through." This all sounds like a friendly arrangement, but it was conducted with the utmost secrecy. The soldiers knew that their officers, and especially the high command, would consider this behavior to be true. It was seen as a lack of fighting spirit, a sign of mutiny. If a senior officer from headquarters came to inspect the trenches, the system had to be temporarily suspended. A lookout would be posted to watch for the officer's approach. When he was spotted, a signal would go down the line. Suddenly, the quiet sector would erupt in a flurry of activity. Rifles would be fired. A machine gun might be let off for a few bursts. A few shells might be thrown. This was the pantomime, a theatrical performance of war designed to fool the visiting brass. The officer would see what he wanted to see. An aggressive, active front hand would leave satisfied. As soon as his car was out of sight, a signal would be sent, perhaps a soldier holding up a shovel, and the unofficial peace would resume. The soldiers were conspiring together against their own leadership, but this fragile peace was constantly under threat. The biggest threat was the rotation of troops. When a new, fresh battalion was moved into a quiet sector, they didn't know the local rules. They were green, full of fighting spirit, and eager to kill the enemy. They would start sniping, launching raids, and shelling indiscriminately. The established soldiers on the other side would be forced to retaliate. They would have to teach the newcomers the rules the hard way. This usually involved a short, brutal period of intense fighting, with many casualties on both sides, until the new unit finally understood that aggression would only be met with equal or greater aggression. After a few bloody days, the newcomers would learn the wisdom of live and let live, and the sector would quiet down again. The high command was not stupid. They knew this fraternization was happening, and they did everything they could to stop it. They saw it as a cancer that could destroy the army's will to fight. Their main weapon against the live and let live system was the trench raid. A raid was a small, planned attack, usually at night, involving a handful of men who would cross no man's land with the goal of capturing a prisoner, gathering intelligence, or simply causing chaos and death in the enemy's trench. Raids were hated by the common soldiers. They were terrifying, high-risk operations that served no strategic purpose other than to maintain an offensive spirit. More importantly, a raid would shatter any local truce. It was an act of deliberate treachery that would inevitably lead to a cycle of bloody retaliation. A successful raid would ensure that the sector became hot for weeks, costing many lives. The generals ordered raids specifically to force their men to kill each other, to break the bonds of empathy that had formed across no man's land. They were deliberately sowing hatred to keep the war going. As the war dragged on into 1916 and 1917, the great, monstrous battles like the Somme and Passch, which consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, began to change the psychology of the soldiers. The sheer scale of the death and the introduction of ever more horrific weapons made the kind of empathy required for the live and let live system much harder to sustain. The High Command's policy of constant raids and aggressive attrition warfare was also effective. By 1918, the informal truces had become much rarer. The war had become too bitter, too total. The live and let live system is a fascinating and deeply human ember from the Great War. It was not born of cowardice, but of a profound and pragmatic courage. It was the courage of ordinary men to look at an insane situation and create their own small pocket of sanity. It was a secret, shared understanding that the real enemy was not the man in the trench opposite you, but the war itself. It stands as a powerful testament to the idea that even when nations demand total conflict, the common soldiers on the ground will often find a way to quietly, secretly, and bravely choose life.